Introduction. Putin, Russia, and the ongoing war in Ukraine have dominated headlines for nearly 2 years. Despite not capturing Kyiv in 3 days as anticipated, Putin seemed to have defeated the coronavirus, at least in the media. Beyond this, his successes are less visible. The world has split over the Ukraine issue. Some countries support Kyiv, others Moscow, while a few remain neutral. In Russia, unrest is brewing. Yevgeny Prigozhin organized, then dismantled, a march on Moscow. Meanwhile, the leadership of the Wagner Group experienced a mishap in the Tver region. This is against a backdrop of increasing repression in Russia and significant military losses. Putin aims to rule indefinitely, prepared to engage in eternal conflict. He is portrayed as a deranged leader, surrounded by similarly mad individuals, leading a country descending into madness. The question, what is to be done, is now more pertinent than ever. But first we must ask, how did it come to this? Part 1. The Fall of the Oligarchs. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, said Baron John Acton. Thus, Putin is not the first to lose his mind to power. Initially, he and his cohorts aimed for absolute control, maintaining a semblance of democracy and adherence to the constitution, but they eventually discarded both. Could anyone have stopped Putin? His first presidential term was challenging, with rampant, almost criminal democracy. Power lay with oligarchs, regional bosses, and criminal groups. The FSB, which Putin had controlled before becoming president, served more as a servant to the new masters of life in Russia than as a controller of strategic processes. Putin's first term could have been his last, but the streetwise boy and his KGB brethren struck first. Putin began his rule by negotiating with oligarchs. We don't touch you, you stay out of politics. Boris Berezovsky was the first to resist and never return to Russia after autumn 2000. Berezovsky was controversial, and his exile was viewed more positively than skeptically. Around the same time, Vladimir Putin was also expelled, trading his media assets to Gazprom for freedom. Similar schemes led to Berezovsky and Badri Patakatsishvili losing their media assets, with Roman Abramovich acting as Putin's negotiator regarding their shares in ORT, now Channel 1. By 2004, when Putin was gearing up for a second term, there were no more independent, influential media in Russia. Part 2. Khodorkovsky. The last significant oligarch in Russia still involved in politics was Mikhail Khodorkovsky, also Russia's richest man and one of the wealthiest globally. In 2003, Khodorkovsky funded political parties like SPS, Yabloko, and the CPRF, and openly discussed a plan for constitutional reform to reduce the president's powers. He was also negotiating the merger of Yukos with Sibneft, and then with Chevron or ExxonMobil. This would have created the world's largest oil company, co-owned by Khodorkovsky, making him one of the world's most influential figures, fully integrated into the global elite. Regarding the Yukos-Sibneft merger, Yukos acquired 20% minus 1 share of Sibneft for $3 billion, and an additional 72% plus 1 share of Sibneft were exchanged for 26.01% of Yukos shares. This meant Sibneft shareholders would control 26.01% of the combined company, which would be fully managed by Khodorkovsky. However, none of this materialized. On October 25, 2003, Khodorkovsky was arrested at Novosibirsk's Tolmachevo airport on charges of theft and tax evasion. On October 30th, the Russian Prosecutor General's office seized a 53% stake in Yukos, owned by Yukos Universal Limited and Hully Enterprises. Khodorkovsky spent over 10 years in prison, and Yukos was taken over and divided among Putin's friends. After this, there were no influential oligarchs or media left in Russia to oppose Putin. Part 3. Siloviki, Security Services. Putin easily dealt with disloyal oligarchs and media in his first term. The under-the-carpet battle with disloyal Siloviki, Security Services, took longer and resembled a global purge. The first victim was General Prosecutor Yuri Skuratov, who Putin implicated in the three-in-a-bed scandal. The FSB was controlled by Nikolai Patrushev, Putin's close ally. In 2001, the Defense Ministry was handed to Sergei Ivanov, a career Chekist, and a potential presidential candidate in 2008. The Interior Ministry was given to Boris Gryzlov in the same year. The only exception was the Foreign Intelligence Service, SVR, headed by Sergei Lebedev in 2000, who seemed distant from the new KGB regime. His successors, like Mikhail Khodorkovsky and Sergei Narishkin, were also insiders. Then, the security agencies were only divided among the inner circle. Notable incidents included the dissolution of FAPSA in 2003 and the criminal prosecution of former Federal Penitentiary Service head Alexander Reimer, beginning in 2015. The case of Defense Minister Anatoly Serdyukov also made headlines, but it was likely not rooted in political motivations. All captured departments underwent multiple reshuffles, quietly removing disloyal elements over the last 2 decades. Thus, the modern Russian repressive system was formed, where decisions are made with a phone call. As for the courts, Vyacheslav Lebedev has been the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court since 1991, previously judging anti-Soviets in the USSR for the KGB. Since 2003, the Constitutional Court has been headed by Valery Zorkin, who approved all of Putin's anti-state reforms without hesitation. The Russian judicial system has barely changed since the USSR, as evidenced by the incredibly low acquittal rate. In 2022, the rate was 0.33%, compared to about 40% in the UK and the US. The latter has a nuance, as only 2% of cases go to court, with the rest settled out of court. The dire state of Russian courts is a topic for another film. Part 4. Opposition. Modern Russia is a totalitarian state. Even in the USSR, there was little semblance of democracy, but modern Russia is worse than the Soviet era. There are no free media or opposition. Why is this? After the oligarchs' complete downfall during Putin's first term, no forces remained in Russia willing to finance a real opposition. There were no more free influential media to convey alternative views to the population. Everything became systemic, and sadly, the Russian population was quite content with it. However, there's always a non-systemic element that needed to be occupied. Since Yeltsin's time, Russia had 2 types of opposition, systemic and non-systemic. The systemic opposition consisted of parliamentary or near-parliamentary parties. Some, like the LDPR, were inherently KGB political simulations. Others, like the CPRF, tried to be independent for a time. The complete independence of all systemic opposition ended in Putin's second term. Now, this segment is not even remotely independent and is directly managed by the presidential administration. The non-systemic opposition consisted of various delinquent elements, usually created or supervised by special services. NBP and RNE are from this opera. There were also various AKM, Defense, Solidarity, etc. In 2006, this led to the creation of the Another Russia Coalition, a direct product of Russian special services. None of this exists anymore. On the other hand, today there's the Navalny phenomenon. However, no one remembers how Navalny appeared, whom he actually imprisoned, and who funded him for a long time. Navalny's only significant factor of success was that he outlived the other part of the Russian opposition when it became unnecessary after the Bolotnaya farce and was simply eliminated. Navalny then effectively accumulated the protest electorate around himself, becoming an uncontrollable political force, which predetermined his end. First, Navalny was poisoned by Prigozhin's killers for a series of articles about the shadow life of Putin's chef. Prigozhin disliked publicity and dealt with the villain in his own way. Then, for reasons still unclear to the author of this film, Navalny returned to Russia from Germany, where Putin's punitive system has been physically destroying him ever since. By returning to Russia, Navalny ultimately destroyed the last relatively independent opposition mechanism in Russia, which was himself. There is no longer any systemic or non-systemic opposition in Russia. Any element disloyal to the current government is simply eradicated. The Russian opposition abroad has not yet formed as a real political force, likely for the same reasons it failed to form in Russia during Putin's early terms. Part 5. Is a revolution possible in Russia? Currently, a revolution in Russia is impossible due to the lack of forces that would carry it out. Most of the Russian population is a systemic electorate, thinking and acting as required by the state propaganda machine. Those who disagree are immediately sent to camps for substantial terms, almost like under Stalin. People can be imprisoned for such innocuous things as a no to war poster or a social media post. All genuinely oppositional structures, like Navalny's headquarters, are equated to terrorists in modern Russia. The West is portrayed as an external enemy within Russia. This image is actively supported by the so-called Russian opposition abroad, which openly calls for the country's disintegration at various forums, organizes Jewish pogroms, and more. This is widely covered by Russian media. Thus, any Russian citizen disagreeing with Putin's regime is automatically labeled an enemy of Russia, allegedly dreaming of destroying Mother Russia. It's worth noting that many European and American political forces actively support such elements. Hence, the question, are they just fools, or is something more intriguing happening, is more relevant than ever. There is also a somewhat oppositional element abroad. There are organizations like the ARC that help refugees, legal aid centers, etc., but they operate on private donations, mainly from Mikhail Khodorkovsky, and their activities are only known from the internet. Thus, a revolution from below in Russia is impossible, but a revolt within the elite is possible. Part 6. Revolt. One revolt already occurred in Russia last year, Prigozhin's revolt. The revolt was prepared for 10 years, and the author of this film was present at its inception. Prigozhin's revolt failed due to Prigozhin himself. He was then killed, and his high-ranking puppeteers were reprimanded, but since then Putin's countdown has begun. Putin is alive only as long as his entourage deems necessary. Power in Russia is now divided between Nikolai Patrushev and Sergei Kemezov. Putin just dangles between them with his Anglo-Saxons under the bed and a volume of GRU philosopher Alexander Dugin in his pants. If the elites decide to remove Putin, they will. When and whether this will happen at all is unknown. But leaks from the FSB's mouthpiece, Professor Solovyov, about Putin in the Valdai refrigerator, suggest these events are real. The FSB is thus preparing the information space for the moment when Putin indeed ends up in the refrigerator, naturally or otherwise. The wait shouldn't be long. Revolt is quite possible.
Part 7. The System. I openly call those who think anything will change with Putin's deeds very ordinary men. Putin is a product of the system that he created. Until 2018, Putin entirely controlled his vertical using a system of checks and balances among the elites, where each received power from his personally. Since 2018, this system has controlled him, bluntly feeding him misinformation. Since last summer, Putin has become nothing. He is ignored in serious elite calculations, his decreases are not executed, and he sometimes just looks like a miserable, helpless man. The system around Putin was built by former KGB functionaries of the old school, red directors, and the younger generation of this elite. There are no outsiders within the system. KGB officers in the USSR were trained for war with the West, taught to kill, enslave, capture, and recruit. That's what they are doing now. The USSR 2.0 project was ready long ago, but under Medvedev, who began pursuing a pro-European course and building his own elite within the country, it was impossible. Putin didn't give it a go during his third term, refusing full occupation of Ukraine in 2014, which he later considered his global mistake. Everything changed after 2018. Having removed all dissenters from his circle, Putin gradually became a puppet of the system, which actively fed him information about Ukrainian Nazis, Anglo-Saxon plots, and his total global support. Meanwhile, information about total corruption, loveliness, and poverty in Russia no longer reached Putin. Putin focused on mythical Ukrainian Nazis instead of addressing real problems with wooden tolerance. And this bore fruit. As a result, the elite formed by Vladimir Putin received a lifetime right to exist. Absolute impunity and absolute power are the immutable attributes of any neo-feudal fascist regime, including modern Russia. Therefore, the fight isn't against Russia or even Putin, but against this system. The system convinces everyone that it's Russia, but it's not. or at least it shouldn't be.
Epilogue. The system might change its face, but not its essence. As long as these KGB agents rule Russia, it will destroy everything it reaches. In the long run, this system might even unite with the similar system built by Xi in China and start expanding together. More precisely, China will eventually swallow Russia, and this poses a threat to the entire world. Both Russia and China had every chance to take a different path, but history knows no subjunctive mood. Likewise, Europe and the US could have taken a different path. Many criticize the US for creating a unipolar world. The problem is the opposite. The US did not create a unipolar world, but brought its foreign policy to absurdity. All these geopolitical problems are accumulating, and they will make themselves known. Ukraine is now only a prologue to more serious problems. Putin will never stop at Ukraine, just as Xi will never stop at Taiwan. So where and when will they stop?